Well, it's been a little while since I talked about one of these Disney movies, so let's jump back into the Disney vault and talk about a movie that technically probably isn't very good, but I have a soft spot for it. Robin Hood. Now, Robin Hood came out in 1973, and if you didn't see my last Disney video, which was on the Aristocats, we are stuck into the dark age of Disney animation. Now, the dark age of Disney animation isn't necessarily when all the bad movies got made, but it was a period of kind of stagnant creativity. Walt Disney had died, leaving kind of a power vacuum in the studio. Plus, this period is remembered for a lot of its cost-cutting methods, namely reusing animation from old movies, using the Xerox process to cut down on ink and paint costs. And I have a lot of thoughts about the Xerox process, and I've talked about them in my past videos, so go check those out. But now we come to Robin Hood, and Robin Hood is an interesting choice for a Disney movie because Disney had already done a Robin Hood adaptation, Robin Hood and His Merry Men, from somewhere in the 50s, and I've seen it, and it's a good fun time. It's very upbeat and light, if not a little forgettable, but it does seem to have more in common with the Errol Flynn Robin Hood more than anything else, and it's a generally good time. But I guess Disney thought that that wasn't Disney enough. We had to make an animated Robin Hood with talking animals. And why talking animals? Well, because one of their other projects that they're kind of developing around this time is a movie called Chanticleer, and that's about a bunch of farm animals and a rooster that wakes the sun with its crowing, and it's based on this old, I think, Aesop's Fable or something, some very old story. But unfortunately for that movie, it never got made. We don't have a Chanticleer movie, and the idea of a Chanticleer movie kind of morphed into this Robin Hood movie told by all the animals, because I would assume that a lot of this character animation that's new for Robin Hood was probably already in development with Chanticleer, and again, trying to cut corners, trying to cut costs. They just kind of reused some of these ideas, folded it into Robin Hood, and this is where we are. And if you are wondering whatever happened with that Chanticleer idea, Don Bluth actually took that idea and ran with it after he left the studio and made the movie Rockadoodle to, I would say, disappointing results. But what is this version of Robin Hood trying to do? What's it trying to get across? How is it telling the epic story of Robin Hood and his merry men? Because this movie actually takes an interesting approach, because it has a very eclectic voice cast to begin with. Because you would expect a Robin Hood adaptation to have very British sounding characters, a British voice cast, and about half of them are. Prince John, Sir Hiss, Robin Hood himself, they all have very British voices. But then you have Little John, played by Phil Harris, which this would be his third animated Disney role in a row, and he's basically playing Baloo again. But you also have Roger Miller as Alan Adale, Andy Devine as Friar Tuck, and Pat Buttram as the Sheriff of Nottingham, and all of those guys have very western cowboy sounding kind of voices, which gives this telling of Robin Hood a very clear western vibe. And that's also brought out through the music here. There's a very eclectic mix of traditional Disney upbeat catchy songs, but also kind of country laid back renegade type songs like The Phony King of England, and probably the most famous song in here, Robin Hood and Little John running through the forest. And personally, I'm a fan of this take because the Robin Hood legend does lend itself to a more western take, and I think if you're going to adapt this story to kids, adding in some western themes and western tone, western influence does make it a bit more accessible to kids to grapple on, because the politics of Crusades era Britain probably aren't that relatable. But if they understand that Robin Hood's an outlaw, that he's rebelling against taxes, that's a very easy way to break it down using iconography from a culture that, again, a primarily American audience would understand better. But there are some things that hold this movie back from being truly a masterpiece, and that is the very apparent cheapness of this production. Now, I've been saying probably since my 101 Dalmatians video that because of the Xerox process, everything looks a little bit cheaper. That you can see the pencil marks in the finished animation, and it just looks a little rougher. And for 101 Dalmatians, I think it worked okay for the story they were telling. In Aristocats, I don't really think it worked at all. But here in Robin Hood, I think it works okay enough. But the fact that we're in the forest and the backgrounds have a very storybook illustrative aesthetic, kind of like what we'll see a little bit later in Winnie the Pooh, where the kind of roughness of the line work is emblematic of that storybook style. And because this movie opens in true Disney fashion with a book, and we open it and we see Alan Adale and he's narrating as he's reading along the book, I think I can give a little bit of a pass to the roughness of the animation here, because it's not super distracting, with one exception, and that is Sir Hiss. And snakes are scaly, they're smooth, they're not rough and furry. And here, I don't know if it was because of the limitations in the animation or the roughness of it, but here, I swear this snake has fur. I'm pretty sure they drew fur on the snake, and that just kind of takes me out of the movie. But aside from that, the Xerox process isn't too distracting. I think it fits all right. But what does distract, and I can't overlook it, as much as I do love this movie and have such fond memories from this movie, is the sheer quantity of reused animation in this movie. That you see it and you see the way certain characters are moving, and it reminds you of those other movies, and it just comes off as lazy. Like, could you not animate your own dance sequence? You had to rip off the dance sequence between King Louie and Baloo from the Jungle Book, because that is probably the most obvious. And even as a kid, I recognized that, and I was like, that's weird. Why is Little John and Lady Cluck dancing like Baloo and King Louie? It just felt like something was wrong here, that shouldn't be happening. And I know this isn't the first time Disney has done this, since even when Walt was still alive, they were very sneaky at reusing little bits of animation here and there to, you know, tighten things up. And most of the time, unless you were paying super close attention, you wouldn't really notice. But here, there is just so much of it where I'm pretty sure more animation in this movie is reused than is original animation just to this movie. And if you include the theoretical Chanticleer animation that they had already made to put into this movie, I would say that there's probably very little, if any, original animation to this movie. But now let's talk about what I love about this movie, and that is that this movie and this telling of Robin Hood has some of the best villains of any Robin Hood telling. Now, I'll always have a soft spot for the Errol Flynn version. I think Claude Rains and Basil Rathbone are perfect for that version that they're telling, and the same thing goes for our villains here. Now, it is interesting comparing these two versions, because Prince John is basically the same in both versions. He's this foppish king with an inferiority complex. He wants to be king, but he just isn't good enough, and he's trying to usurp the throne from Richard, and that checks out, and they're both hilarious. They get great lines in both versions, but the real difference comes in how they treat the Sheriff of Nottingham and Sir Guy of Gisborne, because in the Errol Flynn version, the Sheriff of Nottingham was kind of a loser. He was the butt of all the jokes. He was the comic relief. He was so inept at his job that Prince John and Sir Guy had to step in and basically do the sheriff's job for him to get Robin Hood arrested and all that. But here, the Sheriff of Nottingham is pretty much the main villain here, and he actually has a lot more in common with Basil Rathbone's Sir Guy than he really does with the Sheriff of Nottingham, and just the role he plays in the movie. He's the nemesis to Robin Hood. They're foes to the end. They have this bitter rivalry where he just wants to get him at all costs, which I guess is technically closer to the book, because in the book the sheriff and Robin Hood were more bitter rivals than Sir Guy was. Sir Guy only shows up towards the end. I think he only gets like one chapter about him, so again, he's not a big threat. But speaking of Sir Guy, we don't really have a Sir Guy in the Disney version. We have a Sir Hiss, and I already kind of talked about Sir Hiss, and Sir Hiss I guess is supposed to be Guy of Gisborne, but he doesn't really act like Guy of Gisborne, either the Flynn version, which has more in common with the Sheriff of Nottingham, or in the book version, where he's this hunter that just really wants to get Robin Hood. Here, Sir Hiss is kind of the footstool or court jester to Prince John. He's the comic relief. So in that way, he is more like the Sheriff of Nottingham in the Flynn version, where they are both kind of the butt of every joke. They're the comic relief. And the way Sir Hiss and Prince John bicker and riff off of each other throughout the whole movie, they just feel like an old married couple. They have such great chemistry together, and it's always really funny. Probably the funniest parts in this movie are between our villains, whether it's Prince John and Sir Hiss, or the Sheriff of Nottingham and the Vultures, and those interactions really make me laugh. Crime a nitly trigger, put your pea shooter down. And I just realized I haven't even really talked about the story here, and the story is pretty simple. It follows your basic bare bones Robin Hood plot. Robin Hood's an outlaw running from the Sheriff of Nottingham. The bad guys come up with this scheme to trap Robin Hood, and it's the archery tournament, and this is one of the biggest and most famous scenes in all of Robin Hood lore, I guess. And in this version, Robin Hood does escape, and they have a big party in the woods, and that just infuriates the bad guys even more, so they double the taxes, triple the taxes, squeeze every last drop out of these guys, and those that can't afford to pay the tax get thrown in jail, and before you know it, pretty much the entire town is in jail. Everybody's arrested, and it's here we get our big climactic prison break sequence, and this is probably one of the most suspenseful climaxes that I've seen in a while. The only one up to this point that comes close is probably in 101 Dalmatians, when the Dalmatians are trying to escape and they're dressed like Labradors, and you see the ice melting and it's giving them away. That was a pretty suspenseful sequence, and this one I think tops that, one because it goes on a lot longer, and the stakes are a lot higher, because you have all of these people that need to be broken out of jail and they got to get all their tax money back. They got to rob Prince John because Robin Hood just can't pass up that opportunity. And the first half of this sequence is so quiet and methodical, and you find yourself holding your breath as they're going through this. And then the second half, once Prince John wakes up and freaks out and he calls the guards, it is just a mad rush to get out of there. You realize that these people got to go. They go over the drawbridge. Robin Hood is left behind, and he's got to kind of scramble his way off the roof, and he plunges into the moat. And there is kind of a fake out where he's dead, but honestly, I don't think anybody ever really believed that he was dead. And just the framing of it, the pacing of it, I don't think this movie ever really sold us on the Robin Hood making a sacrifice scene before we realize that, oh, he's alive and everyone's happy. And that's basically the whole movie. There's not really much to this movie as far as plot. It's just one scene after another of Robin Hood doing his Robin Hood things, and you do see things escalate to where the whole town is in jail and they gotta be broken up. But really, as far as deep character studies or emotional weight is concerned, this movie really ain't it. This movie's just a good time, and it knows it. It just wants to entertain your kids, introduce them to the Robin Hood legend, and get them to know all the main players and how they relate to each other. And really, that's all I'm looking for this type of Robin Hood movie. I'm not looking for something on the scale of the Errol Flynn movie, although that would be pretty awesome. I'm actually kind of surprised Disney never revisited Robin Hood when it came to the Disney Renaissance. I think a more modern Disney animated Robin Hood would be pretty awesome. But the movie we got isn't too bad either, aside from some corner cutting as far as the animation's concerned. But this movie is just so earnest in its portrayal of Robin Hood that if you just accept the take that they're going with, that it's not to be taken super seriously, that it's just a bit of fun and entertainment, and that's really all, you're going to have a really good time with this movie. And watching this movie again, after seeing adaptation after adaptation of Robin Hood in the past maybe 20 years or so, where they've just gotten more and more self-serious and dark and trying to do this historical drama thing. That's just never what I found so interesting about Robin Hood as a kid, as a teenager, and now as an adult. What I find interesting about Robin Hood, and why I still herald the Errol Flynn version as the best Robin Hood ever, is that it doesn't take itself seriously, that it plays up the legendary mythic elements to make it larger than life, to make it where people will start sword fighting and in the middle of a fight have a pint with their enemy, and when they're done, go back to sword fighting as if nothing ever happened. That's the world of Robin Hood that I've always loved. It's always been a bit of fun. It's never been super serious. And this Disney version does a great job of adapting that. But now I turn it over to you guys. What do you think about Robin Hood? Have you seen it in a while? Whatever you think, let me know in the comments. And if you like this video, be sure to give it a like and subscribe for more content, and hit the notification bell to be notified every time I upload a video. As always, I'm Colby. This is my Nerdy Talk, and I'll see you in the next video.